Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first day of the Thriving on Campus Pride webinar series. My name is Tin, and I use he, they pronouns. I'll be your host for today. Before we start, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Michael Woodford to do a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Tin, and welcome, everybody. We respectfully acknowledge the territories on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of many Indigenous peoples. I was born in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador on Canada's east coast. As a Newfoundlander, I acknowledge the lands on which I was raised are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and I acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and Inuit of Newfoundland and Labrador. My workplace, the Faculty of Social Work at Laurier, is situated on the lands traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. These lands are within the Haldeman and Tract Treaty of 1784, a formally ratified agreement acknowledging 6 miles on either side of the Grand River here as a treaty territory belonging to 6 nations of the Grand River. Unequivocally, the treaty promised that the tract of land 6 miles deep on each side of the Grand River from the river's mouth to its source was to be enjoyed by 6 nations and their prosperity forever. However, soon after the treaty was signed, it was broken. Today, 6 nations of the Grand River lands comprise only less than 5% of what was originally granted. This is just one example of broken promises, injustices, and oppression of colonization of 6 nations, a history across Turtle Island. The harms of Indigenous expulsion and assimilation are many and are being felt in Indigenous communities today. As treaty people and beneficiaries of colonization, we responsibly acknowledge and understand the history and the experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, both those who are acknowledged and unacknowledged. This understanding should shape our work as we strive towards both stopping the damages of colonization and working toward repair. Understanding this context, I invite us to collectively acknowledge the enduring presence and deep knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous peoples with whom we, who are settlers, share this land today. In doing so, we strive for respectful relationships with all the people across this land as we support collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Thank you.
Michael. Before we proceed, just a few housekeeping items. The first is if you do have any questions during the webinar, please enter them into the Q&A tool in your Zoom toolbar. And we have enabled live transcriptions, which you can turn on by clicking the closed captioning function in your Zoom toolbar. So our Pride webinar series features work from a recent special issue with the Journal of LGBT Youth. You can see the list of guest editors on this for the special issue on this slide. And if you're interested in viewing any of the related papers for the presentations from the webinar series, you can follow the link in the QR code on this slide. So we have 4 presentations today. We're going to start with Steven and Allison with their presentation on examining campus support systems for LGBTQ college students' mental health and well-being.
Great. Give me one moment to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? one of the other panelists just to,
Yes,
okay,
you're
thank you.
good.
All right, wonderful. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Steven Feldman. I use he, him, his, and they, them, theirs pronouns. I am a PhD student in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at Indiana University Bloomington, where I also work as a project associate with the National Survey of Student Engagement in the Center for Post-Secondary Research. And I am really excited to be here and to be joined by my wonderful friend and colleague, Allison. So I will turn it over to you, Allison, to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison BrckaLorenz. I'm an associate research scientist at the Center for Post-Secondary Research. As Steven said, we work together on many of the projects there in the center, doing a lot of queer work and a lot of helping faculty work. We're excited to be here.
All right. So as mentioned, our study that we're going to talk about today was about campus support systems for LGBTQ plus college students' mental health and well-being. Before we dive in too deeply into it, I do want to do a land acknowledgement for Allison and I. So both of us are coming from Bloomington, Indiana, which is on the lands of the Mi'kmaq, Lenape, Bodewadmik, and Sawanwa people. As Michael talked about earlier, I want us to think deeply and intentionally about what these land acknowledgements mean for us. Although I'm not going to take the time to read all of this out loud, I do want us to think about what our relationship with land looks like, what our relationship with Indigenous people looks like, and to think about what we can be doing more to support the communities and to support a healthy relationship with land. So I would encourage us to think about that today and moving forward as well. So to give a quick overview about sort of the context for our study, this is, of course, going to probably come as no surprise to anyone on this webinar that mental health and well-being are some pretty hot topics right now in higher education. We've seen mental health cases rising on college and university campuses, and we know that students are really struggling out there, right? A lot of students are working on and off campus, working many hours in order to alleviate financial strain. We know that students' mental health and well-being is disproportionately affected when students hold one or more minoritized identities. And we also know that on college campuses, just as mental health cases have been rising, we've been seeing more students seeking to access counseling services on campus as well. This was especially exacerbated during the COVID pandemic, but we're seeing the same or similar numbers of cases today, even several years after the height of the pandemic. And with this, we also know that by and large, colleges and universities have been unable to meet the rise in demand of the services, right? And this could be for any number of reasons. It could be because of staffing or funding. But what we know is that largely colleges and universities are not doing as much as they perhaps need to be doing in order to support students in the different ways that they might be struggling on campus. And of course, all of this is made worsened for LGBTQ plus students who face disproportionate rates of negative mental health and well-being. And again, knowing LGBTQ plus students, there's a number of reasons for this. This could be because of things like microaggressions, bullying, harassment, and other kinds of victimization that queer students may have to deal with, whereas straight students may not. And so with all that said, in recent years, I think we've seen an uptick in research that has looked at some of the positive aspects of queer students' mental health and well-being. So some research, for example, has shown that when faculty and staff affirm their students' gender and sexual identities, that can have really positive outcomes for students. So improving their academic success, their ability to envision a future for themselves, as well as impacting their overall well-being. And so all of this is sort of the background context for the study that Allison and I decided to do. So our study is guided by 3 research questions. So the first one is, how do different subpopulations within the LGBTQ plus community perceive difficulties related to health, workload, and relationships? The second question looks at those same subpopulations, but from a lens of support, looking at personal and institutional relationships. And then the last research question is, what do LGBTQ plus students see as potential avenues for support from their institutions? And so to guide these research questions, we used a conceptual framework that was put out by two different organizations. So one is the JED Foundation, which is a nonprofit that does work related to mental health and well-being, especially in youth. And then the second organization is the Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals. And so these organizations, along with a team of individuals who were sort of outside of those organizations that were brought in, created this Proud and Thriving framework. And what I thought was really helpful about this framework was that it framed mental health and well-being in terms of what they called risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors were things that negatively contribute to mental health and well-being, whereas protective factors are positive contributors to mental health and well-being. And what I thought was also helpful about this framework was that it distinguished between the factors that would impact queer and questioning students and the factors that would impact trans and non-binary students. So instead of looking at the LGBTQ community as this large umbrella, they looked at sexual orientation and gender as having two different kinds of experiences that students might have. For our paper specifically, though, we did choose to look specifically at sexual orientation and not gender identity. That's not because we don't think that gender identity should be looked at. Of course it should. Unfortunately, we were using secondary data in a way so that when it came to the demographic questions, there were some limitations with how gender was collected. And so for this study, unfortunately, we did choose to look specifically at sexual orientation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Allison to speak a little bit more about our study.
So as Steven and I mentioned, we worked with the National Survey of Student Engagement, and that's where our data came from. Largely, the survey is about what students are doing while they're in college or university, what sort of effective educational practices that they're participating in. But we do have a relatively new item set about mental health and well-being that institutions can choose to add to their administration if they'd like. And so we limited our study to institutions that chose that module and then students who responded to that module. We ended up with about 65 US institutions here and 27,000 student respondents. But our study, we focused entirely on the over 6,000 students that we have identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I'll talk about what that identification means in the next slide. And I'm also and no, I'm going to trip over that acronym LGBTQ plus. So I'm just going to broadly say queer, but that encompasses a lot of identities, which again, I'll talk about in a moment. So with this framework that we used, we identified on the survey several risk factors, and it actually aligned really nicely with the set, although they were not created in conjunction. But our risk factors were around health issues, workload, which sort of generally encompassed working and finances and academic load, things like that. And then relationships. And I want to specify this is relationships and relations with other people that were stressful or difficult in some way. And I stress that because the next thing we looked at, protective factors, was also about relationships, but there were two different ways to view it. In the protective factors, they were more like, how do these different types of people support you in your well-being? So there were personal relationship questions and then institutional actor relationships, so your instructors, advisors, things like that. So those were largely the measures that we were looking at. We also had an item set that asked students if they know where to get help about different issues, and so we'll talk about that one as well. I won't get into the statsy details, but we did a bunch of regressions and descriptive analyses to answer our questions. All right, here is the, how did we identify LGBTQ plus? And I'm going to refer to an answer somebody asked in Q&A. I'm going to answer it live. Yes, we did include asexual students. So we have an option ace gray asexual, and they were included in our study. So Nessie, I think, which is rather nice, has a check all that apply for sexual orientation. So we have a long list of identities, and students are able to select as many of those as apply to them. And so of the over 6,000 that we looked at, this was their percentages of what they chose of those identities. Note it does not add up to 100%, and that is okay because people could select more than one thing. One thing that I think is confusing that we wanted to point out is that because they could select more than one, many of the students who chose a traditionally queer identity also chose straight. So we did not cut those people out. We included them as well, but we're going to refer to them as straight plus, not having a better term for it. But the straight plus students essentially chose straight and another queer identity. And just if you're curious, we don't want to talk a lot about straight and straight plus people. These are the other things that they were selecting on the right. So that was how we identified LGBTQ plus, or queer as I'll broadly call them. So here we have a table. If you are into juicy, statsy details and tables of coefficients, I'm going to invite you to go look at our paper. Instead, I'm going to present on a slightly more simplified view of our results. So what you're looking at here, for each of the identities within LGBTQ plus or queer, we either had students who felt less difficulty or more support, represented with a smiley face. The frowny face results were students feeling more difficulty or less support, and that is compared to the average score of the queer students overall. And I should have pointed out on our respondents, about 50% of people in our queer subpopulation chose bisexual. So just note that the average score is a little skewed towards bisexual. But what you're seeing here then is a mix of different varieties of people feeling more or less supported in different ways based on their particular identities. And we go into reasons for why that might be in our paper. But we do see some patterns. The straight plus and questioning unsure had a lot of kind of relationship issues going on, which we think may be in conjunction with their identity. Lesser known identity, the pan and poly also having some different less supportive situations, but it wasn't all bad. There were some people with more supportive kind of views than the rest of the group. And now Steven will talk a little bit more about the sources of support that they could get on their campuses.
All right. Also, I hope that you all can hear this. They, of course, I don't know why, but Tuesdays are the day when they do lawn care outside of my apartment. So hopefully you can't hear the lawnmowers going, but just wanted to mention that just in case. So yes, so we were also really interested in thinking about, where did students know, or did students know where to go to get support for the different kinds of issues that they might be facing in college that could impact their well-being? And, to perhaps no surprise, towards the bottom of the list are things like depression or anxiety or mental health crises. If a college campus has a counseling center, oftentimes students are made aware of that on campus tours or during orientation or first year seminars or things like that. So oftentimes there's a lot more advertising about counseling centers. So it wasn't necessarily all that surprising that only 20% or so of students did not know where to go to get support for those. Having said that, I personally think that 20% is still a high number. You're talking about 1 in 5 students that don't know where to go to get support for that. So do want to highlight that. But what I think is more important to highlight here is that at the top of this bulleted list, you can see that there are a number of issues that students might face where they don't know largely where to go to get support. So things like sleep difficulties, lack of care for dependents, housing insecurity, emergency financial situations, and substance abuse. Over 50% of students did not know where to go on campus to get support for those kinds of things. And of course, everything on this list we know can impact students' mental health and well-being. And so for us, this is kind of a cause for concern around, perhaps universities and colleges are doing some work in some areas to support students, but perhaps either they're not doing work in other areas related to well-being, or they are doing that work but aren't advertising it. And so either way, this is an area for growth for colleges and universities.
So Steven, just less than 5 minutes left to go.
Perfect. We were on the last slide, so we were doing well for time. So in thinking about what all this means, there were a few key takeaways that we wanted to highlight here. So first of all, we need to continue to disaggregate data pertaining to the LGBTQ plus community, right? As Allison mentioned, the average when in our regression table, all of those were compared to the average of LGBTQ students. And with such a large number of bisexual students, that meant that the average seemed to skew more towards bi students. And yet, even with that, we found that, for example, pansexual and polysexual students still had notable differences. right? And oftentimes in research, we see bi students and pan and poly students just grouped together in a category called bi plus or plurisexual. And what our study shows is that actually these really need to be disaggregated further because they do have notable differences from each other. This also shows that students who identify as straight and another sexual orientation may also have differences that make their experiences unique when compared to other straight people and when compared to other LGBTQ people, right? Oftentimes we think about this sort of binary of you're either straight or you're not straight. And if you at any point identify remotely with straight, then therefore you're not in the LGBTQ community, you must be straight. But what our study shows is that actually a lot of those students that may identify straight and something else may have experiences that are different from other straight people and actually closer in alignment with other queer folks. And so we need to move away from thinking about sexuality as a binary of straight and not straight. And then lastly, as I was talking about, less than half of LGBTQ plus students in our study knew where to get help for a variety of different things. So again, we either need to create more resources or we need to create more awareness of the resources that do exist. Because even if schools are doing all of this amazing work on their campuses to support students, if students don't know where to get help for that or where to access those resources, then at the end of the day, the colleges and universities are still failing to support their students. And so all of this was sort of an overview of some things related to campus support systems and ways that we think that both researchers and campuses can do more to understand the experiences of LGBTQ plus students. So with that, thank you all so much. We will look forward to taking your questions in a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much, Steven and Allison. So yes, just a reminder, we'll do a Q&A after all the presentations. Our next presenter, Evie, will present on their presentation titled, I have had several providers who recognize my humanity, exploring the overall health and positive healthcare interactions of transgender and gender diverse college students.
Hey folks, just gonna try and get my screen shared here. Yeah, okay. Oh, I see what I want to do. Yeah, that pretty much gets the section that I want. Okay, awesome. So, hey, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about a study that was done by myself and my advisor, Dr. Shanna Katari, exploring the overall health and positive healthcare interactions of transgender and gender diverse college students, which we titled with an in vivo quote, "Pronouns aren't just performative." I want to start by doing a land acknowledgement for where I am currently sitting, which is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. And note that it is better that we acknowledge these in words than not do so, but there's a lot more that can be done. There are some movements and opportunities for engagement on the screen. And I also want to note that more than just the Indigenous folks in this country, our institutions are built on the backs and through the labor of enslaved Black folks. And I want to honor that legacy and the Black life, knowledge, and skills that have been stolen through violence and white supremacy. And so turning now to the survey data, this data comes from the University of Michigan Trans Health Survey. This survey was put together by a multidisciplinary team from across the University of Michigan, and then brought to two different focus groups of trans and gender diverse students whose feedback was incorporated. It was open for a couple months in the late fall and winter of January of 2021 to 2022, so we'll keep an eye on that timing. It'll come up again later. We had about 121 total respondents after we had done data cleaning, which we estimate was about 2% of the student body and around 1/6 of the trans and gender diverse students at the university who might have responded. And I'm going to walk you through some quantitative results related to investigations of students' health and mental health self-ratings among different gender identities. As well as some differences in how they rated their primary care providers in terms of trans affirming behaviors, and differences between both students of different gender identities and those who had providers on and off campus. And then we're going to take some time looking at qualitative responses in which students talked about what aspects of provider affirmation were most important to them, what positive experiences they had had, and what they were doing to take care of their own health and really thrive and be well. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the big team of amazing folks who worked on this. Susan Ernst, Rochelle Wilcox, Monique Steele, and Diana Parrish are all co-authors on the paper. These other folks all were involved in the creation of the study or the visualization of the data. I particularly want to call out Shi-Chang Yang and Jax Kin, who did our data visualization. And if you want to go and grab that study, this link will take you to it so you can dig into a little more depth than I will get into in today's presentation. So starting with some descriptive statistics, who these students were. We had a really broad range of gender identities. So all of these options here in descriptive statistics allowed people to both self-identify, fill in what identity worked best for them, and then also picked the best option, from a range of gender identities. And what we're seeing here are the pick the best fit options. So it's worth noting that among these trans and gender diverse students, more than half, almost 2/3, identified as non-binary or genderqueer. And then we had a variety of different trans masculine or male identities, trans feminine or female identities, as well as a couple of agender students. If you're looking at these numbers and you do go check out the paper, I'll note that in our paper, we excluded the people who said NA, who said none of these responses fit for them. And so we have very slightly different percentages in the tables in the paper than you'll see here as were put together by the folks who did our wonderful data representation. So just a note there. When we get into analyses, I've done some clustering for the analyses. So non-binary students include those agender respondents. Trans masculine, trans men, and men are one analytic group. Trans feminine, trans women, and women are another analytic group. Just want to take a note that we also had a real diversity of sex represented here. It's very easy to think, even in a world where we think about a lot of spectrums, that sex is a binary category, but nearly 8% of our sample was intersex, some designated at birth, just about 4.7%, and about 2.5% who had been designated later in life. So even here we see a real representation of sex represented. And also sexual orientation. So none of our analyses have to do with sexual orientation, but just to note the diversity of the sample. We also had a whole lot of bisexual folks, about 1/3 of the sample. Another big chunk were queer, and a very small section of this sample identified as heterosexual or straight. So just to note, we sometimes think that you can sort of have a gender minority status or a sexual orientation minority status, and it really is clear from the sample that there is a lot of overlap between those two groups, those ways of identifying and being in the world. Finally, taking a look at our racial and ethnicity, a fairly white sample, a little bit less white than the state of Michigan, but pretty representative of the university. Higher education institutions do tend to be, I think, a little bit more diverse than some of our less diverse states. Worth noting that we did not collect information on immigration status or international students. So that is not something I'm able to report on, and is a piece of learning for if we were to expand this survey or run a similar survey again. These students came from all over the university. About 2/3 of them were undergraduates. About a quarter of them were graduate students. That includes master's students and doctoral students from across the institution, as well as law students. And about 9% were health sciences students, including students in medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, and nursing. And we are going to talk a lot about primary care physicians. Most of the sample who responded to this question did have a primary care physician. Most of those who did had one off campus. That was about 45%. Only about 18% had a primary care physician on campus. That would be at University Health Services. And then another 34% didn't have a primary care physician at all. In examining their overall health, students were feeling not too bad, not great. So about 5% felt they were in poor health. Our biggest chunk was fair health, but a fair number of these students felt that they were in good, very good, or even excellent health. But it's a little bit worse when we look at mental health. I'll remind us that this was done during the pandemic, which was a time when a lot of people weren't feeling emotionally great, even if they weren't actively sick. And here we see nearly 20% of our students felt their mental health was poor. About 48% felt it was fair, and smaller chunks felt it was good, very good, or excellent. In fact, for analyses, I went ahead and clustered the very good and excellent categories because there were so few people who felt they were in excellent mental health. So, taking a moment and examining some quantitative findings. Looking at health and mental health, these I examined in terms of trans-feminine students, trans-masculine students, and non-binary students. And for each of these, trans-feminine students were our reference group. I did that just to make sure that I think we often think of sort of male people or male-bodied people or male appearing people as sort of the baseline, and I didn't want to make that choice, so I made a different one. Among these groups, health ratings didn't differ significantly, but mental health ratings did. And the real difference was in non-binary students who only had about a 0.25, less than a 0.25 odds ratio of the positive mental health rating. So they were less than a quarter as likely to rate their mental health as fair, good, very good, or excellent than trans feminine students. But odds can be a little bit difficult to interpret. So we'll look at the actual model estimated probabilities of each of these ratings for each of these student groups. And if you look at the poor rating, we see the trans feminine students had just about a 7% estimated likelihood, probability of saying they were in poor mental health, but it was almost a 24% chance for those non-binary students. We have the most similarity among groups in the FAIR rating, which makes sense. That was one of the biggest mental health ratings that we had. We see our non-binary students start to drop off in probability when we get to a good mental health rating. And when we get to very good or excellent, they drop off a bunch. It's almost the reverse of what we saw with the poor, where the non-binary students had only just under a 7% chance of rating their mental health as good versus the trans feminine students who had a 22, almost between 22 and 23% chance of that very good or excellent mental health rating. So there are some notable differences here in terms of mental health based on student gender identity, even among trans and gender diverse students who are often considered sort of a single group. In terms of PCP inclusivity, there's a lot of text on the screen, but I'm going to sort of simplify these results for you. What we found is a sort of a mixed bag of how inclusive people felt their primary care physicians were. They said, in a single item where they just said, how good are they? The rating tended to be somewhat or very, but in a validated scale where we had a lot of items related to trans-inclusive provider practices, the mean of the whole sample was below the middle of the range. So that would be a little bit below that somewhat. We found that students whose PCPs were off campus had a significantly higher ratings of trans-inclusive provider practices than those with on-campus PCPs, those students who were accessing their healthcare at UHS. And we also found significant differences among different gender identities. So trans feminine students had the highest rating of provider inclusivity, followed by trans masculine students, and then non-binary students had the lowest rating. We double checked to see if maybe trans feminine students were more likely to get their healthcare off campus than other genders, but they did not. So these seem to be two independent results that we're seeing here. Turning now to the qualitative findings, which I think is really the richer findings of this mixed method study. We looked at students' responses and identified two broad themes, one of concrete actions, which had 3 sublevels: institutional, organizational, and interpersonal sorts of actions, and then a theme of recognizing agency and humanity, which didn't have any sub-themes. It wasn't as sort of subcategorizable as this as the concrete actions ones, but did have very different levels of validation. I'll walk you through some quotes to explain what I mean. So in terms of the positive healthcare experiences, at the interpersonal level, students said things like, healthcare providers jumped through hoops in order to get my insurance to cover top surgery, or going to a clinic and having a provider that used informed consent as their trans healthcare model instead of the WPATH standards. And while they have been revised recently, for many, many years, those WPATH standards, that's the World Professional Association of Trans Healthcare Providers, involved getting letters of support from mental health providers before you could access trans-affirming care. And then finally, primary care provider had trans stickers on computers and was very supportive and non-judgmental when discussing gender identity and any possible gender-related care. Doctor did not ask probing questions about a possible gender transition process and carried on with normal care. So just visual signs of being affirming and allowing trans students to, talk about their trans care needs when they have them, but not have that centered when that's not what they're seeking at today's visit. In terms of organizational actions, we saw quotes, things like having trans non-binary staff and providers at the clinic, pronouns and preferred names on intake forms. So who you hire and what your forms look like are very much an organizational level decision that can have a big impact on trans folks' well-being. Having an endocrinologist who is genderqueer, again, who you hire is going to have an impact on these TGD students' experiences. And then another student said, through UHS, I have experienced positive trans-inclusive care in which I have been asked my name and pronouns and asked if there was any gender-relevant problem or care I was seeking, and otherwise, again, not being required to discuss or educate on my gender. This was affirming. So just, being able to seek gender care when it's what you're seeking and not have to talk about that if that's not what you're there for. In terms of positive healthcare experiences at the institutional level, those concrete actions included a low overall barrier to entry and UHS services being mostly covered by tuition. That made a difference. And another student noted that the graduate student union here at University of Michigan bargained for insurance to cover trans health care. So noting some of the different intersections of those institutions that can come together to create a more affirming healthcare situation. Finally, in terms of recognizing agency and humanity, not finally, we've got one more section after this. Students had these different quotes that illustrate how these experiences go from like kind of bare bones to really rich affirmation. So at the most bare bones level, those few providers who literally just treat me like a person. Many providers subtly treat me as though I am somehow less than, but I have had several providers who recognize my humanity. Another student said, UHS treated me like a human being. Another said, providers who treat me like a normal adult rather than infantilizing me. Another, doctors not questioning my motives behind wanting certain services. Another, mental health providers being affirming of my gender allows me to not have to take on the labor of educating or explaining. And then one student said, just constant affirmation that I'm a guy from my OBGYN, referring to me as one of her men. And you can consider that gynecological services are probably an area of some discomfort for people who identify as male or men. And so this provider really did the work in the context to make a big difference in the students' comfort. So there's a real range of like what feels like having one's humanity recognized. Finally, self-reported health activities. Students reported this huge range of activities they engaged in to maintain and promote their own health and mental health, including traditional methods like exercise, sleep, going to therapy, seeing the doctor, and eating good foods, self-reflective methods like journaling, meditation, art and music, sensory needs, and being outside. Connective methods, finally, like cooking, having sex, walking the dog, spending time with friends, and particularly engaging in queer friendships or other groups that were important to them, like a support group for sexual assault providers. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, one implication is that trans and gender diverse students are a really important source of information on what trans affirming care can look like. This is really rich, deep, nuanced information that we can really build off of. Another is that pronouns alone are not enough. Providers and researchers and others should understand that gender identity is complex and affects overall well-being. And we should consider that trans and gender diverse rights and affirmations exist and can occur at each systems level. So at the micro level, that individual level, providers and researchers should educate ourselves on trans affirming practices. At the meso or organizational level, we should work to ensure that medical establishments and counseling spaces and other organizations are inclusive. And at the macro level, we can advocate for trans and gender diverse rights in institutions and legislative practices. It's not a great or easy time to be a trans or gender diverse young person in the United States. And to the extent that we can use our voices, our platforms, our presence to improve that situation, to push back on some of those policies, it is inherent on us to do so. So I want to acknowledge again my wonderful collaborators, our funder, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and finally the trans, gender diverse, and disabled communities for engagement, guidance, and ongoing resistance in the face of oppression. And if you want to reach me, my email address is here and my wonderful advisor's email address as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Evie. I am just going to share. I'm just going to move us into the break. So we'll come back at 2:55, so in about 10 minutes or so. And just a reminder that if you do have questions, please put it into the Q&A function tool. And then for the presenters, if you do notice a question directed at yourself or your presentation, if you can answer it live or wait until the Q&A session as well. So we'll come back in about 10 minutes time. Thank you again, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. So next we have Briana and Ellie presenting on the School of Social Welfare Transgender Justice Group. To you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Briana McGeough, she, her. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare, and I provided a sort of support role as an informal faculty mentor and advisor for the Trans Justice Group. Eli, would you like to say a couple words about yourself?
Yes, my name's Eli Shafaf. I recently graduated with my MSW. I was the facilitator for the Transgender Justice Group for the last year. And also just a heads up, it is also lawn care day outside of my apartment. So I hope that that does not get obnoxious throughout the presentation. So I apologize for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eli. And the School of Social Welfare acknowledges that the University of Kansas occupies land that has been cared for by several tribal nations. This land acknowledgement recognizes that Indigenous people are traditional guardians of the land, and there's an enduring relationship between Indigenous peoples and traditional territories. Our school affirms, advocates for, and supports the sovereignty of the 4 federally recognized tribes of Kansas and the other 574 federally recognized nations in the US. And I'll also note, I think that link below provides some important information about current actions that we're doing to support our relationship with Indigenous communities, as well as I think some important areas for growth there as well. So background in the spirit of a lot of things that folks have been saying, trans and gender diverse people and communities in the US are experiencing a lot of challenges and oppression, frankly, both in terms of policy, and we're based in Kansas, so we've seen a lot of structural violence at the policy level, as well as challenges within the school in terms of a lack of access to inclusive facilities, such as bathrooms, locker rooms, things like that, as well as shortcomings in the curriculum, microaggressions in the classroom, et cetera. And the Trans Justice Group was really created to address concerns at both this like bigger structural level, as well as in the university and school on a Midwestern campus, the University of Kansas, as you might guess. And so this presentation really hopes to describe the formation process and activities of the Trans Justice Group, as well as provide recommendations for students, faculty, and staff who are interested in creating similar groups. So I think it's a little bit less traditional of a research presentation than some of what we've seen today. And the hope here is that by getting some sense of some of the things that we have done in terms of the structure of the group and the advocacy initiatives, as well as by providing some recommendations for how one might do some similar things in the context you all are in, and then discussing the impact of the group and future directions. We'll provide a little bit of information about things we've done and also provide some information that could be useful if there's any interest in replicating some of these efforts on you all's campuses. So in terms of the formation of the group, thinking about the goals the Trans Justice Group tried to achieve. So trans students alongside supportive faculty founded the Trans Justice Group in the School of Social Welfare. And again, I'd really like to emphasize the point that this was a student-led initiative where sometimes students leverage support from faculty to help sort of work towards the goals of disrupting transphobic oppression on campus, creating support for the members, and promoting increased understanding for students and faculty at our school to better serve trans populations. And I think that's a really important point as well, since we are a school of social welfare, was we really did try to center the mission, vision, and values of our profession to encourage members of the social welfare community to join some of the efforts to support trans students in our school. In terms of some of the core tactics, education was a big one. I think we're in an institution of education, and so use this tool a lot, and we'll provide a little bit more information, but things like trainings to faculty to provide more supportive classrooms, mutual help, and Eli will discuss this more extensively, but more informal emotional support. National coalition building. This is a place where I think we really managed to leverage pretty effectively this, nascent student group with some of the pre-existing initiatives on campus. And so we have a center focused on LGBT research and advocacy that already ran a symposium and a virtual town hall, as well as provided a fair amount of continuing education units. And so I think we did some really good work in terms of the Trans Justice Group capitalizing on some of this pre-existing resources to work towards these goals. And then direct advocacy with administrators. So things like talking with the Dean of the School of Social Welfare about publicly acknowledging and challenging some of the transphobic policies at the state level, as well as sort of other requests around things like more inclusive hiring practices for trans folks and making sure that we are hiring folks who will support our trans students effectively. And this also, I think, felt to me a place that as someone in more of a faculty support role, having a little bit more context about some of the initiatives happening at the school level felt like a place that I was able to provide some support to the students in the group. Eli.
All right, so the meetings themselves. These were all monthly meetings via video chat. And as we mentioned earlier, they were student-led meetings, though we did occasionally bring in faculty members for support as we felt that it was needed. We elected to create a non-hierarchical leadership structure. So rather than have a president and vice president and all that of the group, one person was chosen to be a facilitator, and their job was pretty much just to send out the meeting invitations, set the agenda for the meeting. But we typically, like I said, had a very non-hierarchical structure. There wasn't really anybody in charge, or anybody who spoke more than anyone else. We did work through decisions about group membership, as well as things like what advocacy actions we wanted to take, what local initiatives we wanted to participate in. These were discussed during the meetings, as well as how to engage effectively with the school, determining what issues we were able to recognize and who would be the best person to reach out to about them. These spaces also provided opportunities for the students to get support for issues that we were dealing with, both in and out of school, in particular regarding, anti-trans legislative action in our state, and just unfortunately the kind of nationwide anti-trans efforts. Now, these meetings were typically 1 to 2 hours long. And I will say that usually about the first hour to hour and a half was very focused on advocacy, but we definitely always left space for that emotional support and the community building. And outside of our meetings, what we felt was incredibly crucial was actually we had a group chat. We just used the app GroupMe. And through this chat, we not only discussed, the technicalities of our meetings and planning, but we really focused on celebrating trans joy, by sharing our successes, from anything from I finally, graduated, to I just passed a paper I didn't think I was going to get a good grade on, to I finally got an appointment made with a doctor who's willing to help me with HRT. Just anything going on in our lives where we felt like there weren't other people that we could necessarily turn to. We had each other, where we could share those successes. We also asked and answered each other's questions, about anything ranging from affirming faculty to locating affirming providers, things like that. Which again, we shared those gender affirming resources. We also, like I said, provided support, and it wasn't even necessarily specifically for trans related issues, but it could be anything from, having a bad day to just, needing a safe space to air whatever's going on. This group chat proved to be pretty essential for us developing community and resiliency. As I said, the meetings were typically geared more towards our advocacy efforts. And then it also gave us time to asynchronously determine like what kind of activities we wanted to participate in. All right, and then as we mentioned earlier, we did speak with administration regarding issues, particularly with the syllabi, or instructor competence with with TJG, I apologize. TGD. Acronyms are very similar. Content, transphobic internship sites. One of the key elements of a social work program is that we do have practicums, and unfortunately not every practicum site or internship site was affirming of the trans student's identity. And then also promotion of our group to other TGD students. I apologize. So one example of this is we did formally request that the school administration release a statement regarding anti-trans legislation across the US, as well as providing resources for trans. I cannot do acronyms. I really apologize for TGD students. I'm a great public speaker.
I think you're doing great, Eli. And yeah, these acronyms are tough. So some additional advocacy actions. And again, I think these are some of the places where we leveraged some pre-existing resources, and I think that was really to the benefit. So one was a roundtable discussion. Actually had some similarities to a bit of what we're talking about here at a National LGBTQ Research Symposium to discuss topics related to the group's history and support within the group, as well as trying to provide some lessons learned for other folks who are potentially interested in doing something similar. And then there were a few webinars over the course of the year. One made use of some pre-existing teaching and learning communities that exist on our campus where folks are already coming to learn how to make their classrooms more effective and inclusive. And so we were able to grab a slot in one of those and talk specifically about creating more gender affirming classrooms. And then also there was a broader conversation about using social work and social work strategies to challenge the increasing environment of anti-transgender legislation across the US. And that was another place where we were able to leverage some pre-existing infrastructure for events that already happened to sort of focus and highlight some of the concerns that students in the group were bringing up.
So as we mentioned a few times, this was more than just an advocacy effort. There was key supports going on between the students as well as the faculty. We were able to identify faculty and staff who were willing and able to provide that supportive roles. Now, one of the key things is if there are no supportive faculty and staff in the department, we found that it could be necessary to collaborate across departments as well. Other recommendations, we believe that determining a deliberate leadership structure is crucial for effectively running the group. Our first year was a little amorphous, and there was some chaos, but determining what kind of structure we wanted that group to have, which again, for us, we decided on a non-hierarchical leadership structure, served our interests as well as reflected our ethics. Also outreach, balancing openness with confidentiality and safety. The way we managed this was we did word of mouth outreach, which included faculty reaching out to students who would potentially be interested in participating in this group. Sustainability ended up ultimately being one of our biggest challenges for the group. There was very much a reluctance to expand membership because we had developed just this very safe, close-knit group. And so there was some hesitancy around expanding membership and potentially introducing unsafe elements to the group. And unfortunately, because of that, we graduated. And there were very few members who were kind of still with the university. So that sustainability was definitely a big challenge. And as far as our impact goes, we do believe that we have increased to some degree safety and belonging for TGD students. Aha, I got it that time. As well as increased knowledge of TGD identities within the School of Social Welfare. We did improve awareness of alignment between trans inclusivity and social work values and ethics as well. And again, as far as future directions go, sustainability being a key challenge. we want to focus on giving future students the opportunity to rebuild. We made all of our documents and materials accessible through Briana for any future students who want to re-engage with this group, as well as also exploring potential partnerships directly with the School of Social Welfare, advocating for all future campus infrastructures to include all gender single stall restrooms, mandating diversity courses for staff and instructors, which includes information on gender minority groups. And then ultimately, it's our hope that TGD students would be included in key policy decisions, though not being tasked with the primary responsibility of enacting these changes. And then there's our contact information.
Great. Thank you so much, Briana and Eli. Sorry for the mispronunciation of your name earlier. Our next and final presentation is with Anna and Jacob about students' perceptions of all gender restrooms after implementation. Can't hear you, Anna.
Well, it's good we made it this far with no tech issues.
I can hear you now.
Glad to be the first. There we are. All right. Screen is shared. Everyone can see.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And that is great. Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. First, I want to acknowledge thanking our colleagues for giving you an introduction to life at the University of Kansas, to conditions in Kansas, for providing a land acknowledgement, and just for providing a resource for our gender diverse students at the university. That has been great over the last couple semesters and years. So I want to first introduce both of us. My name is Dr. Anna Pope. I am an associate teaching professor at the University of Kansas. I've been there about 8 years, and I have been doing research on different types of interventions for LGBTQ and other types of diversity on campus for the last, 7, 8 years now. And one of my students, Jacob Randall, was my co-author on this paper. Jacob?
Yeah, my name is Jacob Randall. I'm a post-bachelorette research assistant with Dr. Pope, and I have plans to continue my education.
All right, thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and have Jacob get us started.
Yeah, so we're gonna be going over the study student perceptions of all gender restrooms after implementation. Diving right in, I just want to go over a couple different ways that these all gender restrooms might look. A common example when people think of all gender restrooms is the single fixture restrooms, which you can see here on the left. These are just they're single locking, single stall restrooms that are meant for anyone and everyone to use. While these are great, there are a couple problems that can come up when trying to implement these restrooms. One is that they can be cost prohibitive. Whether you might have to like tear down new walls, put in new plumbing and whatnot. And it can cost a decent amount of money that businesses and organizations either don't have or unfortunately aren't willing to spend. You also might run into a separate but equal type of issue depending on how they're implemented. Well, if we're choosing the worst restrooms in the building, we're only doing one restroom for the whole campus, to use. On the right, this is what we did at our campus. We just took the traditional gendered restrooms and put up paper signs saying that they're all gender. You can use whichever restroom that you identify with. Well, this is okay. The signage is a bit problematic, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Now that we know how these all-gender restrooms might look, we need to know why they're important. The literature has shown that gender diverse individuals have experienced many problems when using all-gender or when using traditional enforced gendered restrooms. And these problems can lead to avoidance of public restrooms, which comes with its own host of issues. Specifically, we're looking at impacts to academic performance, whether you're skipping school or you're so distracted from having to hold your urine all day that you can't focus on your studies. Literature has also shown negative impacts to mental and physical health outcomes. The minority stress model adapted for gender diverse individuals shows how negative mental health outcomes might come to be. For negative physical health outcomes, we're looking at urinary tract infections and kidney infections from having to hold your urine for so long. On the right here, the ACLU is currently tracking 115 anti-LGBTQ bills in the US. Implementing these all-gender restrooms is particularly important because of the effort to enforce these traditional restrooms. For example, in Kansas, we had Senate Bill 180, which may put definitions of gender based on sexual reproductive organs, and then tried to enforce the restrooms that people were able to use. Using all gender restrooms is a potential way to sidestep this legislation. For the current study, it was a very simple study. It was 5 to 10 minutes. We did it on Qualtrics. We had our main restroom related measures. We simply asked, are you aware that the all gender restrooms exist on campus, and have you used the all gender restrooms? We were also curious about benefits to experience. Do the students perceive that the restrooms and the signage that has been implemented benefit their experience on campus? Our main restroom related measures was comfort and safety. This was done on a sliding scale, 0 to 100. Asking students, how comfortable do you feel using all gender restrooms? How comfortable do you feel using the restrooms with someone of a different gender? And how safe do you feel using the all gender restrooms? Unfortunately, safety using the restroom with someone of a different gender was not able to be analyzed due to improper coding. We also included a couple personal predictive factors, specifically gender essentialism, right-wing authoritarianism, and conservative political affiliation. All three of these in the literature have been shown to be correlated with transphobia, and therefore we're expecting negative correlations with our comfort and safety measures. And then we also included age and gender identity for our demographics. We had two main hypotheses that are personal predictive factors, gender essentialism, right-wing authoritarianism, and conservative political affiliation are going to negatively correlate with our perceived comfort and safety measures. We also expected gender diverse students to score higher on the benefit to experience measures. And we had a research question. We were curious if there was going to be significant differences in comfort and safety between those aware of the all gender restrooms and those not aware.
All right, so I did want to just kind of throw in there that reason for the research question that we're asking is because part of this research was kind of spurred by some of the pushback that I've seen in reaction to me and other folks suggesting that we should have all gender restrooms. That pushback being that other people who are not gender diverse will not feel comfortable using those restrooms. I've heard, claims of everything from people will get sick from holding their need to go to the bathroom to people will be uncomfortable and not enroll. And while me, you, and the rest of the audience here are probably pretty confident that none of those ideas are actually true, we needed some data to kind of show that. So that led us to having that research question and led us to really doing this research study in the first place. So going over first the test of our first hypothesis, which was looking at the relationship between comfort and safety using our all gender restrooms and traditional individual difference factors that correlate with transphobia, we see the trend. And I will note that we do have our entire correlation table here. I'm just focusing on the main ones with our individual difference factors on the left here. And we will see the trend that our individual difference factors that typically positively correlate with transphobia negatively correlate with comfort using our all gender restrooms, comfort using the all gender restrooms with someone of another gender identity, and with perceived safety using the restrooms. So in other words, the more likely you are to report that you are uncomfortable or feel unsafe in these restrooms, the more likely you are to be higher on these individual difference factors of gender essentialism, right-wing authoritarianism, and specifically conservative political ideology, which really goes with the general transphobia literature. All right, next up, we looked at mean differences between those who self-identified as gender diverse and did not self-identify as gender diverse. Now, as you saw in our table of participant characteristics, we actually had a relatively small number in a literal sense of gender diverse participants, only 11 counting across anyone who identified as transgender or a gender identity that was not man or woman on our gender question. However, as I suggest every time I talk about this, we can look at it as either 11 being a relatively small number or 11 out of 150 being a relatively large percentage that captures that 7-ish% that seems pretty good as far as estimating the percentage of students in the modern day who identify as gender diverse. That might even be kind of low considering. So I want you to take these results with a grain of salt because one of our groups obviously is very small while the other is not. However, the trend was in the direction that we expected, such that our gender diverse students reported more benefits to their experience, perceived benefits to their experience from the inclusive restrooms than those who were not gender diverse. Now, not so much for the signage. As Jacob already kind of said, the signage was flawed at the first implementation of our all gender restrooms, and that'll be reflected throughout the study. But generally, this is encouraging because we're already seeing kind of a mixed implementation of all gender restrooms as benefiting perceived experience. We also had this question about awareness, if people who are aware of the all gender restrooms will have any more or less comfort with those all gender restrooms. Honestly, we were just hoping for no mean differences, but what we found instead was kind of the opposite of that lay theory that things are going to go terribly wrong, that instead the people who are aware of the all gender restrooms scored higher on perceived comfort with people of other gender identities in the restrooms, and perceived safety in the restroom. Obviously, we can't claim that the knowledge made them more comfortable because we can't really look at directions since this was a correlational data collection. However, I do find this a step in the right direction for showing that, those who were aware of the restrooms did not seem to be any more afraid of them than anyone else. There's another way I want to word this though. Our scale actually went from uncomfortable to very comfortable and had moderately comfortable in the middle of it. And I want you to think of all your experiences in public restrooms throughout your life, right? Would you say in general that you feel moderately comfortable using most public restrooms? I know I wouldn't, right? Most of the time our reactions after using a public restroom is, I'm glad that's over. It's gross in there. Why did they poop on the floor? Awful reactions like that. And in general, we had 82% of our samples saying they were at least moderately comfortable using our restrooms. We do have generally clean, generally nice enough restrooms. They kind of need updating, but otherwise they're fine. So it was nice to see that large percentage of people saying they were moderately comfortable. Over 70% saying they were moderately comfortable with someone of another gender, and over 80% saying that they felt moderately safe using the restroom, which again, I think is just really good when you consider how people generally feel about public restrooms. We also had a free response question asking people if they were to design their ideal gender inclusive restroom, what would they do? We did this because I was hoping to improve the all gender restrooms afterwards. And we did get a few most important or most common themes that we saw from participants. And that first one was privacy related. People would really like to have floor to ceiling doors with no gaps. Now, the Kansas City International Airport has implemented really cool all gender restrooms recently that are very modern, nice, and expensive. We do not quite have the funds to do that, but it's good to acknowledge that that is something people would like to have. The other concerns we were able to do something about. People were very concerned that period products were not in the formerly men's restroom. So that's one of the things we talked about as a campus afterwards, and we have had period products and trash bins added to all of our all gender restrooms to help improve those. We've also worked on the signage concerns. The signage that we had was confusing, right? There was the all gender restroom sign in the middle of the door, and then to the left or the right, a men's or women's sign that was a product of the earlier times of the restroom. We have since gotten those changed, and that is a big takeaway from the research study, in my opinion. So we've managed to address what we can of these before we actually rebuild restrooms. And I wanted to show you all, kind of one of the wins of this research study is that after presenting this research to campus leadership, after talking about it multiple times, here we have updated signage, right? Are our all gender restrooms perfect? No, the formerly men's room has urinals, the formerly women's room doesn't. People have talked about that the urinals are a little close together, that the stalls aren't perfect, and those sorts of things, but they have period products, they have trash bins, and they have proper signage now, which I think are all just kind of signs of what you can have change from a relatively easily implemented research study. It wasn't a high cost research study or anything like that. Obviously, one big limitation is our campus was small. That actually kept us from collecting a lot of demographics. We hesitated to collect too many demographics because some of our programs on campus are so small that we could see people feeling very identifiable if we were to collect too much information. So we kept it to gender and age for that reason. We also were not able to offer reimbursement at this time. And if we were, we would be able to use the complete gender essentialism measure. We'd be able to use a more commonly used right-wing authoritarianism measure that's a full measure and just have a little more strength from that. Additionally, if we get a larger sample, obviously, we'll be able to generalize a little bit more, which is something we want to do because we want to use what we have now to encourage people to implement all gender restrooms, but more data will be more encouragement, which is what we want. So quick take-home messages. This does reaffirm that, having all gender restrooms, it's come up multiple times in today's webinar already. Having all gender restrooms is beneficial. It's a good thing to have. It'll help us avoid a lot of unfortunate situations for students who do not feel they can spend more time on campus, right? We want students to feel that they can be comfortable, happy, and included on campus. And we don't want restrooms to be something that they're too worried about to be able to focus on their studies. The next thing I want to say is that this was cheap, right? A lot of times I've gotten pushback when I talk to people about all gender restrooms of, well, Anna, it's a great idea. We want to do it, but we don't have the money to even, clean our restrooms properly and whatnot. And this was very cost efficient. And is it perfect? Is it ideal? No. Did it happen overnight and make things just a little bit better? Yes. And I think that it was functional. And then finally, I just want to say that the majority of our participants felt comfortable and safe in our all gender restrooms, which is cool. It's a positive thing. And I think we should use that as encouragement that, going forward with this, being mindful, paying attention to reactions to what we do right and what we do wrong, all very important things. And that, we just want to keep this up. Next steps, future projects, really fast. We want to collect faculty and staff data. We think that it'll be a little bit different, so we do want to see that. We would really like to collect data from people who go through the Kansas City International Airport because they do have those fancy all gender restrooms as illustrated here. And we would like to also work on the potential of manipulating gender essentialism, because out of our individual difference factors, that's the one I think would be most ethical to manipulate, since gender essentialism correlates with lack of support for gender equality and sexism. Actually teaching people that most gender differences are exaggerated would be helpful and may actually encourage people to support all gender restrooms. If you have questions for us, please feel free to reach out to us. Both of our emails are here. We also have a QR code if you want to easily get to the paper that is the focus of today. That's great. And if you want to ever chat about implementing all gender restrooms, what you think we could do better, what you would like to do, or kind of have us talk about our story to help you have evidence that you should be implementing it at your organization, and especially your campus, we would love to chat. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna and Jacob. So I'm gonna hand it over to Michael to walk us through and moderate our Q&A.
Great, thank you. I want to say a big thank you to all of our presenters today. I am, even though I've read that your manuscripts and such, I'm learning a lot, and also the confluence of ideas and such is so rich. So I think everyone getting some hearts and applauses and the emojis and such. So thank you everybody for coming into this space with us today. Just to remind folks that if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and we're going to use our Q&A function for those questions. And I can see a couple of questions there already, but also a thank you to our presenters and such. One question that I had for Briana and for Eli was thinking about the idea of the peer support. And that's you, Eli, you talked about the emotional support that was within those meeting spaces. Do either of you have any ideas about what about replicating this in a non-helping profession? You were within a school of social work where you would, or social welfare, where we would assume and hope that participants would have those kinds of skills to support one another, especially as things are becoming increasingly more transphobic and laws and so on and so forth. That like that sense of emotionality, I'm sure might have been great. I don't know if you have some comments around that if you'd like to share. So feel free to turn your mic on and jump in.
Eli, do you want me to start, and then you can throw in anything that else comes to mind? Sure. So I think probably a piece of that, and we oscillated, I think, back and forth some with to what extent to bring in, say, counseling, campus counseling, or sort of other more formal mental health support resources. And I think there's always been some awareness that those resources exist and a potential pipeline for, if folks want to access them. But for example, our campus does, through the counseling center, also have some peer support resources. So I think there might be some really rich opportunities to build collaborations with some of the peer support entities that exist. I also think related to that, a lot of campuses have training for student groups who want to have a peer support element. So I think potentially seeing if that might be something to leverage as well would be some additional support in figuring out, and I think even in this role, it's important to note that yes, sure, I am a licensed social worker, but I'm not really operating as a licensed social worker in that capacity, but trying to provide some additional capacity building and leverage some of what universities often more broadly have to help student groups succeed. Eli, did you have anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of forming a similar student group in another department, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department at KU. And again, not a helping profession, but we're all really coming at it from very much a lived experience perspective. And I think a major boon for us, whereas with the TJG, we had the social work code of ethics as kind of a North Star that we could fall back on. In the WGSS department, we're really identifying for ourselves as a group what like I said, what our North Stars are. you know, what is important to us. And I think centering those goals, about advocacy, inclusion, one of our big ones is building community among trans and queer students. I think that really helps when, even when you're outside of a helping profession, just firmly establishing what the goals are of the group and kind of expanding off of that. And just really recognizing that we're all here, we're all in it together, and moving forward from that perspective seems to be helping so far.
Right. That's really helpful. I think reminding us why the group would be there, the shared goals and maybe shared values and such, you know. And I think about also people are clumsy at times, so maybe there's a way that that's part of like sort of the values as well. It's like, you know, if something happens and maybe we figure out how do we make repair of those things happen as we moving forward. And it's exciting to hear you're replicating it in another department. That's great. So thank you. Yeah. We do have a question here in the chat for our last presenter. So I'll read the question and then Anna is going to take the question. So Dr. Pope, I know you've done an excellent job incorporating undergraduate research assistants into your studies on gender inclusive bathrooms. What have been the most important lessons you've learned about working with undergraduate research assistants on these projects?
First, I want to thank Alex for this question. I appreciate it. And I do really want to encourage everyone to, you know, get their students involved in this kind of work, especially undergraduate students as well. I honestly would not have managed to finish this research project at this kind of opportune time when we had just implemented all gender restrooms without the encouragement of Jacob. Honestly, Jacob really kind of encouraged me to go forward with this because I'd been talking for years about how I would really like to collect data on a time that someone implemented all gender restrooms and the world didn't burn down, nothing exploded. And I was talking about how we had them, and Jake was like, let's do it now. And so we did it, right? We did it relatively quickly. We had a quick turnaround time, honestly, a very positive and quick publication time as well. Everything worked out really well. And I think the students in the research lab have been really happy to see something that started and ended while they were in the research lab, and also being able to see efficacy, right? Like I feel like a lot of undergraduate research projects kind of, you know, begin and end without really getting published. And I think a study like this, that's, you know, something that is currently implemented on campus that could be improved, is something where you can show that kind of efficacy, which is really encouraging for young researchers. So I think this kind of social issues and campus social issues research is really appropriate for students. And I have had the greatest experiences working on this with my students because they've been able to tell me how things look from their perspective throughout the study.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I was wondering also, this is for Anna and Jacob, but for others as well, because we've got a diversity of campuses. And so thinking about inclusive bathrooms, restrooms, you know, one of the things I've heard anecdotally is building codes. Are people running into building codes that talk about we need to have an equal number of male washrooms and female washrooms? Briana, I'm seeing you nodding. Eli, I'm seeing you nod. I don't know if one of you want to take it, and then maybe Anna, if you have any, or Jacob have any comments you want to add.
And I'll note that Anna and I are at the same institution, but you know, I've been here for 5 years, and the journey on the Faculty Staff Council, and talking to contractors who had, you know, I think language that was very inaccessible to someone who wasn't a contractor, that I think there was quite a bit of pushback. So I think that is actually one of the reasons that I was so excited to see the work that Anna and Jacob did, was because like that was a long road building up to that. And then like they really pounced on this awesome opportunity when we saw what felt like pretty sudden changes. And so, yeah, I just want to name that, like, that was a long road, and, you know, it started long before I got involved with those efforts. But I think just a really exciting opportunity to collect really timely and important research data.
Great. Thank you. I forgot you were both at the same institution, but yes. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else want to, Anna?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of the barrier that people have towards doing this type of work is perceptions, of there being barriers, right? Like there may not actually be any real barriers to it. There may not be building codes or state codes or anything saying that we can't have all gender restrooms, but people believe they're there, right? The recent laws trying to limit restroom usage across the country are kind of the first times that restrooms are going to be really legislated as laws. And people just assume they always have been, right? People are surprised when you say, well, actually, having gender restrooms is kind of a choice of individual companies and businesses. So I think a lot of it really is perceptions that we need to, educate ourselves on what is actually there at your state and in your areas, and just work with the actual rules that are there, which these things are less regulated than we might assume they are.
Mhm. Thanks. I'm going to move us on to another question, which we got from one of our attendees today. How can we effectively engage queer and trans students in survey studies, or in general, when they lack a safe space and visibility on campus, especially in conservative environments or predominantly white cities or campuses? So maybe a couple of people want to take that one, have some ideas. Feel free to turn your mic on and jump in.
One thought that I've actually at times been surprised at how much folks want to participate in research studies, that I think there's an opportunity to share stories there that can be meaningful. I also think it's really important to frame in very explicit terms before folks get involved what the hopeful benefit is, and both for the community and potentially individually. And so I think being very transparent about what that is as well. So most of the research I do tends to be intervention studies, and there is a very deliberate, at least, intention for reductions in, say, mental health or substance use symptoms. And so that's a place where I do try to frame the study as hopefully being helpful and advantageous to folks. I also think kind of an important piece there as well is not doing what's sometimes referred to as helicopter research, where you sort of show up and you do your survey and then you leave and are never heard from again. So it's, for me personally and philosophically, important that all studies I do have an engagement plan within the agencies that I'm working with, both of like what sort of additional support I might be able to provide the agency. So for example, before I've maybe used an agency to support me in a survey that I'm doing for my own research agenda, done, say, a program evaluation or something they've done. So trying to make sure that there's some sort of benefit to the agency, but also being transparent about what that dissemination plan might be as well. So it's just really my hope that we're not just extracting data and running with it, but as much as possible, and realizing there are limitations with this because of confidentiality, but as much as possible, trying to be explicit in how we can hopefully benefit the folks who are being so generous with their time and energy and vulnerability. I guess last piece is when we can compensate folks, which isn't always, but when we can, I think it's ethically really important to do so. And so I've tried to prioritize having at least a little bit of money to express some gratitude for folks being so generous with their experiences.
Great, thank you, Brianna. Evie, please.
Just a few quick things. I really agree with what Brianna said in terms of there being actually a great interest among trans and gender diverse students for sharing their experiences and sort of adding to the body of knowledge. We found in our study that was not the trouble. We had some barriers with the administration. So we reached a much smaller subsection of the population than we hoped, because the administration refused to send out an all-campus email. So they alerted a random subset of 2,500 students at the university, which you can imagine were mostly not eligible. So then we had to sort of fall back and do a lot of snowball sampling and more proposive sampling, reaching out through groups. And so we did get a lot of interest, but it wasn't, we weren't able to reach out to people who were perhaps like not already involved in supportive spaces, because the university wouldn't allow us to contact all students. The other thing I'll note is that with compensation. I also really, really encourage compensation. It does come with its own issues in survey research in particular. So we had a fair number of false responses that we had to weed out. It's not, $10 may not seem like that much, but it's a meaningful amount of money to do an online survey, especially when you can kind of blast through it because you're not giving it much thought. We had one particularly funny false respondent who entered SNEED for everything. So their religious affiliation was SNEEDist, their gender was SNEED gender, their sexual orientation was SNEED sexual, which makes data cleaning more fun, but is still not what you want to get. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs in structuring this sort of research, but I don't actually think that trans and gender diverse people not wanting to engage is as big a drawback as you might think.
Thank you for adding to that conversation. Anybody else want to comment before we move to the next question?
I was going to say for Steven and I, although we might call ourselves researchers, our perspective is a little different in that they're not research studies for us. They're assessments of campus and campus cultures. And because we go to like 500 to 800 schools a year, we have to be kind of broadly accessible in terms of language. And so that was a big thing that was important to us, was ensuring that the language could be, kind of broadly viewed and understood, and we tried to make it as inclusive as possible, taking out gendered language. There are no more like his or hers or things like that in there, making sure that our demographics were as inclusive as we could without getting overwhelming. So there were a lot of choices we had to make in language of like, which identities do we list or which we don't, always including spaces for write-ins, so that people can put more specifics in there, but also like I read every single one of them so that we can continue to learn how the language is evolving over time and keep editing our questions to stay ahead of that. And we do a lot of like trainings. I was just presenting about inclusive demographics last week, where we talk about ensuring that your subpopulations on campus have their particular language when you're doing your specific things, because most of the words we use, and a lot of us in this presentation, they're very white words that we're using. And so just being sensitive to the subpopulations that we have on our campuses and the different cultures and the ways that they describe their orientations and gender identities is very different. So language is a way that we have tried to make sure that students are seen and welcomed and feel comfortable at least responding to our questions.
And that's a really great reminder. Thank you, Allison, and especially in terms of how people see themselves in, we often think demographics are just demographic questions, right? But also, thinking about the recruitment materials and, for example, the use of binary pronouns, for example, if that's part of the consent form or what have you. Like there is so much. And certainly, the question that Anna got earlier around, working with undergraduate students is like, I think many of us work so closely with the populations that we're, there's a partnership there that's happening as well, which I can tell you from when we did our Thriving on Campus study here in Ontario, we did a lot of work around sort of cognitive interviewing related to our survey questions, specifically demographics and such as part of that, and ensuring that there is as inclusive as possible, not just gender and sexuality, but also race and ability and such as well. So important. And maybe that's another conversation we can pick up as we move along. So I'm just going to add, there's another question here for Anna and maybe for others, but related to the questions surrounding building codes, did the study have any tracking regarding specific locations of the restrooms, such as academic versus residential buildings? And if so, were there any trends in the attitudes based on location?
That's unfortunately a very easy question to answer. We only implemented restrooms in 3 buildings on a satellite campus, so there was really no variation in what restrooms we were talking about. We were only talking about the all gender restrooms, all on the 2nd floor. of the buildings on that satellite campus. One thing I wanted to say about that is we are hoping to move forward. We have a multi-year plan to add a single stall all gender restroom on the first floor of every building for a combination of reasons. One, to have that single stall option, one, to have the option across 2 floors, and then 2, because we want to have a more accessible mobility-based option than having all of the restrooms on the second floor. It has its problems, the way we did it. But as far as different types of locations, we need to replicate this, right? We need to do studies in residence halls. We need to collect data. We need to collect that airport data. We need to collect data at various businesses and restaurants and whatnot to see if it's basically the same, right? We had, a relatively young sample of a mix of undergraduate and graduate students, but we need more just to show that this is helpful. And I think residence halls is a really good place to target.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I also think we have so much to learn from airports and other places. And I think here, I know for a while I was taking pictures and of really inclusive signage that I was seeing and such. And here at our university, there was a group of students a number of years ago, and Eric, who is helping to coordinate our series, was actually involved in that, where the signage was identified by students, and we had some single stalled restrooms that could be easily converted, and we've moved into other signage for what would traditionally be gendered washrooms as well. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think the advantage of especially working with community is so important in that way. So I'm going to ask, we have another one here. What approaches or initiatives do you believe would effectively encourage greater participation and sustained interest from cisgender individuals in data collection efforts and ongoing educational activities, as making allies and advocates help provide safer spaces when gender nonconforming people are not necessarily always equally represented in spaces, and the need for better educated cisgender allies and advocates will help improve spaces for that gender diverse people may access in the future, and ensuring the work is done before they access these spaces. So it's not directed at anyone in particular, but if you have some thoughts about how might we sort of facilitate more allyhood, I think, and especially engaging cisgender individuals in some of the educational activities. Not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm wondering, Eli and Briana, since you're part of the initiative, was trying to do some educational work, maybe you have some reflections to add to get us going in response to that question.
Sure, I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts. So I do think as much as like shared and common interests can be leveraged, the better. I think Eli spoke beautifully about the code of ethics as our North Star, but like that has done a lot of work for us. I think that's been really meaningful in terms of helping folks to be like, yes, this is professionally important. I think it's also at times been somewhat protective as we live in environments where there's some squelching of DEI discussion on campuses, being like, this is a professional mandate. We can't be accredited if we don't do this, has thus far been helpful and meaningful. And then I don't know, related to shared interests, finding sort of alignment. I think there's a question on here that, might be spoken to in a little bit about cisgender folks and gender inclusive bathrooms, but like that being a place where these single use bathrooms are helpful to a lot of folks for a lot of different reasons. Some related to ability, chronic illness stuff, mental health stuff. There's just like a lot of reasons that these single-use bathrooms can be helpful. Folks with young children, just like, so I think also finding, are there places where there's a shared goal between trans and gender diverse folks and other perhaps disparate, perhaps also, it's worth noting, intersecting identities as well. I also think there's no substitute for sort of one-on-one conversations. So I think we've done, a lot of these trainings, and they can sometimes be helpful. I'll also note that I think so often the folks who show up to these trainings are the folks who are probably already doing kind of the best job to begin with. Or like, I don't know, I sometimes go to these trainings to find the other queer people on campus. Like, I think that often the folks who attend trainings are not the folks who most desperately need trainings. And so I think, for instance, we also leveraged a lot of, most faculty members have a faculty mentor in our department, for example. And so trying to leverage that relationship as well and kind of personalize some of those conversations, I think can also be helpful. Eli, did you have things you wanted to add to that?
My main points were going to be, focusing on intersecting goals, and also, wow, my brain just completely blanked. There was another one, but you already said it, so my point was that I agreed with you.
If I may add just real fast, I just want to acknowledge, two kind of things. My go-to has always been if we can kind of slip this type of education into our classes or into things people are already attending. Like we have a yearly educational opportunity that people can enroll in that teaches about social oppression across the United States. And for the last 3 years, we have included talk about gender diversity just because being in Kansas, it has been a topic that has been relevant the entire time, as we have laws on the docket every year. So we've got it in there. People may come for different reasons than specifically talking about gender diversity, but they'll still see it. I also, encourage us to have things in our classes. Like I talk about the theory of gender similarities instead of gender differences in lots of my classes, which really kind of goes across gender essentialism. However, at the same time, we are looking at laws potentially in Kansas that are going to limit what we can require people to do with regards to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're kind of up against, well, it's a really good idea to put these things into general learning. It may be impossible in some states, at least for a while, or we'll have to get clever with it.
I do actually have something to add if there's time.
Yes,
Just kind of on top of what Anna was saying. I do think also just kind of more casually including gender diversity in classrooms and in curriculum would be helpful. I know a lot of the courses I took as a student, and this is speaking more for educators rather than researchers, but we would have like a unit on gender diversity where it was very specifically like, okay, focus on gender diversity for this week. Whereas just maybe using gender diversity again for social work in case studies where that's not the point. It just so happens to be a case study about somebody who is gender diverse. So I think just more kind of casually including gender and sexual minorities in, the content that professors are using. So it's not a special week of, teaching about queer experiences, but it's just casually kind of worked into the content. I
absolutely.
think that could be really beneficial.
Great reminder. Thank you. We do have 2 more questions in the chat. One is specifically for Anna and Jacob. So if you wouldn't mind maybe typing the response to that. And the last question that's here is asking about experiences using participatory research approaches. And again, maybe I can invite our panelists to respond in the chat. And once they type a response, it goes to a public. So I'm going to turn it back to Tin because we would like to wrap up on time. But over to you, Tin.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to our panelists and presenters today. Thank you to all presenters and the authors of the papers included in this special issue. Here. So this webinar series is brought to you by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Centre for Leading Research in Education, and Wilfrid Laurier University's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives Fund.